Welcome back to the Ulduar Raid Guide. My name's Ciderhelm, I'm the administrator of TankSpot.com, and in this video I'll show you our Iron Council hard mode strategy. If you'd like more information or would like to learn more about downloading this movie, click more info on the movie information box on YouTube to head directly to TankSpot. Also, be sure to subscribe by clicking the subscribe button to the right so you'll be automatically notified as we release new movies. Killing Steelbreaker last is a patchwork-style DPS race with enormous raid healing requirements. We found the best balance was to bring 2 tanks and 5 to 6 healers to the encounter. Additionally, 2 non-tanking paladins with Divine Sacrifice are extremely valuable. During the Steelbreaker phase itself, you can either attempt to kill him within 3 tank deaths, or plan your cooldowns around a 4th tank to increase the DPS time for your raid. I'll clarify that 3 tanks and 4 tanks refers to rotation of tanks due to unavoidable tank deaths that occur during Phase 3. But either can be performed fine with 2 tanks using Soul Stones or, ideally, Glyphed Rebirth to get back in the encounter. Prior to killing Steelbreaker though, you'll need to kill off both Mulgim and Brundir, which offer unique challenges in the way the encounter is approached. Phase 1 of Iron Council hard mode works very similarly to the normal encounter in that the abilities of each of the targets do not change. You will still be dealing with a small AoE aura, sporadic cast from Brundir, and runes from Mulgim that the raid should take advantage of and the tank should move Mulgim out of. It's important for the raid to realize that neither Phase 1 or Phase 2 are DPS races, and they should pace their threat, mana, and cooldown usage accordingly. We found using a Fell Hunter was the most reliable way to break the rune buff Mulgim casts on himself. During this time, the Steelbreaker tank should be careful not to move too often, as Steelbreaker will occasionally target somebody else with Fusion Punch if the tank is moving. Additionally, the Fusion Punch Dispeller should be aware that there is a small chance for the Dispel to fail, so there should be a backup as often as possible. After Mulgim is dead, Steelbreaker begins using his Static Disruption ability, which is a direct damage spell and debuff he casts on a player that greatly increases nature damage. This debuff will also apply to players near his target. Since Steelbreaker still maintains his raid-wide AoE during this time, and his overall damage increased when Mulgim died, it is important to take this ability seriously. Nature resistance auras during the rest of the encounter are critical. Static Disruption will always prefer targets at a range and will only target players in melee range if there are no targets at a range when he is ready to choose a target. The debuff stacks and lasts for 20 seconds, so a single player cannot take the debuff every time. There are 2 ways to handle this during Phases 2 and 3. First, as you'll see in the video, you can have 2 to 3 players cycle in and out of melee range, leaving your desired target at range to be targeted by Steelbreaker. This is very controlled, but it will lower DPS or healing from any players involved in it. The alternative is to leave 3 players out of range at all times. This is due to a secondary targeting mechanic. Steelbreaker will not apply Static Disruption to a target that currently has Static Disruption if there is another player without the debuff at a range. Positioning in Phases 2 and 3 is critical. The strategy we found worked best was for Brundir to be tanked in such a way that melee players could attack Brundir while still in range of Steelbreaker. All other players, including the Steelbreaker tank, would be at maximum melee range from Steelbreaker. Ranged players will be at a range on the opposite side of Steelbreaker from Brundir. This works because, if positioned correctly, Brundir's overload falls just short of the range required to hit the raid on the other side of Steelbreaker. Since a melee can still stay in range of Steelbreaker, they will never be in danger of Static Disruption being cast on them and can focus on interrupting lightning whirls. At about 20% health left on Brundir, we call for most of the raid to switch targets to Steelbreaker to get debuffs active and ready for the burn phase. At this point, we decide whether or not to wait until another overload before killing Brundir, as it's important that the tanks be able to face Steelbreaker away from the raid without being hit by an overload themselves. When Brundir dies, the encounter becomes a burn phase. Steelbreaker increases his damage and now also applies a debuff to his current tank, which increases their damage output by 200%, but also causes them to melt down and die after 30 seconds. When meltdown occurs, it also deals very high AoE damage. Tank switches will need to occur immediately before the meltdown occurs, so the previous tank can run away from the raid before exploding. When any player in the raid dies, including the tanks who melt down, he will heal for 1 million health or 10% of his life, so long as a healing debuff is applied to him. He will also increase his damage by another 25% for each player death. It is important that no one other than tanks die at this time. The first tank has about a 10-second lead-in time before the debuff is applied, giving your raid about 40 seconds of pure DPS time before his first heal occurs. Since many players will be able to make use of cooldowns twice during this phase if they use the first one immediately, we choose to burn Heroism immediately. Before the first tank dies, we aim for less than 50% health remaining on Steelbreaker. Glyph of Rebirth is by far the most stable way to revive a tank in this encounter. However, if you choose to use Soul Stones, the tank must watch raid health for ticks of Steelbreaker's AoE and resurrect immediately after one so they can be healed up. If you're planning on killing Steelbreaker in 3 tank rotations, have your paladins begin using chaining Divine Sacrifice AoE shield walls immediately after the tank transition occurs to the 3rd tank. If a Retribution Paladin uses this first, then taunts Steelbreaker, then salves himself, he has a high chance of gaining the 200% damage buff from Steelbreaker, but this should only be done if the encounter cannot extend longer than 30 seconds and will not go to a 4th tank. If you're using 4 tanks, the AoE shield wall should be saved for immediately before the 4th tank taunts. The 3rd tank also needs to make sure cooldowns are chained on themselves and buffs/debuffs are active on Steelbreaker in the next tank. Whether you're using 3 or 4 tanks, you can make the fight easier by using a mage ice block rotation near the end of the encounter. If a mage goes to range and everyone else stays in melee, the mage will take a static disruption. He or she can immediately ice block, and as long as they stay ice blocked for 10 seconds, they will also take a second static disruption without taking damage. Thanks for watching this movie. As always, feel free to ask questions or add suggestions either on YouTube or in the strategy thread on TankSpot.com. Also, TankSpot donors can download all of these movies in high definition directly from our servers. Click the second link in the movie information box to learn more.